Good morning, Stephen Brobst. Welcome to DS Summit. You're a Chief Technology Officer for TERADATA Corporation, and you were also Obama Advisor on Science and Technology. Your presentation was dedicated to the topic issue of bias, and more precisely eliminating bias in the development and in the deployment of machine learning. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, I think my main point was that bias is not eliminated because we use mathematics and AI algorithms. That humans are still responsible for developing these algorithms. Humans are still responsible for selecting the training sets that influence those algorithms. And we need to have processes in place, and we need to recognize that bias hasn't gone away. And this is, in my opinion, the biggest issue that will inhibit the widespread adoption of AI. There was a research project done by IDC that predicts that by the end of next year there'll be a huge backlash of society against AI because they don't understand it, they don't trust it, and they want AI out of their lives. And actually that would be a bad thing because AI has a lot of value to give, but we will not be successful in introducing AI into society if it's perceived as unfair or biased to certain populations.
And how do you think we can introduce AI to the society and educate people?
I think one of the most important things is transparency. Very often AI is like this black box that we know there's some data that goes in and we know there's some recommendation that comes out, but how did that happen? And very few people really understand that. And I think that one of the big contributions of GDPR that went into effect last year is to actually make it law that there has to be explainability, there has to be more transparency. Because once you have more transparency, then you can examine, you can question, you can refine, and that will make people more comfortable. People don't get comfortable with something that's inside a black box that they don't understand. It feels like it's hidden. You know, what bad thing is happening inside this black box? There might not be anything bad happening, but because I can't see in, I'm not willing to trust.
And more specifically, do you think that we have to speak more about AI in the news? Should we introduce this topic in the schools, in the university?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, I think at some level AI might even be talked too much in the news. It's so overhyped, it's going to do everything. And most people's knowledge of AI comes from Hollywood. I'm not sure that Hollywood is a particularly accurate source. It was interesting, one of the politicians earlier talked about the fact that 30% of the population didn't really understand AI, admitted they didn't understand AI, and 66% actually said they had some understanding. Actually, I don't believe the 66%. I'm actually more worried about the 66% who said they understood but don't really understand because they probably have these Hollywood versions of AI in mind. And that actually is going to scare people more, right? They're going to think about Terminator 2 and Skynet and AI taking over the world, and that's not really what's happening. And that's not the kind of scenario that I'm worried about. I'm more worried about systematic bias and how decisions and recommendations are made. Small decisions and recommendations, small at some level in the big scheme of things, but big to a person's life. If I don't get a mortgage, or I'm getting the wrong product recommendations versus somebody else, or I don't get a discount and you do get a discount, that's unfairness. And that causes bigger problems to me than this, Hollywood stuff where, some computer's going to take over the world. That's not reality. There's a computer scientist at Stanford University who talks about, worrying about, Skynet and computers taking over the world is like worrying about overpopulation on Mars. Yes, it's some theoretical eventual thing that we should be thinking about, but we barely know how to get to Mars. We really don't need to worry about overpopulation yet. So let's worry about the real issues facing day-to-day life of people in society rather than these kind of Hollywood issues.
Great. And so what is AI for you?
Well, it's interesting comment because artificial intelligence is what people usually use that acronym to stand for, but I actually like to use the term augmented intelligence. In really important decisions, I don't necessarily want the computer to completely replace the human. actually I think that when computers and humans work together, you get much better outcomes. So there's been lots of studies, for example, in healthcare, which I think is one of the most important areas where AI can contribute. Doctors have a certain level of accuracy in diagnosing, certain diseases and so on. And let's say that their error rate is 4%. And for even very complex diseases, AI software, we can get to 98% accuracy. So we've cut the error rate in half. But what's more interesting to me is when we use the doctor and the software together, then we get to only 0.5, half a percent of error rate. So the real power is when we bring these things together, not when we try to replace one with another, right?
Great. And so speaking about the education and general public, you say that the problem that people do not know about AI, that we should educate them, and that they see it as something esoteric, that's something in a black box. But in your presentation, you said very clearly that AI is math.
Yes.
And if we put it like this, maybe presenting it as science, it would also have a better image for general public.
We want to demystify it, right?
Yeah,
let's not make it a black box with pulling rabbits out of hats and so on. Let's demystify it. Let's make it transparent. Now the reality is, not everybody's completely comfortable with math. Right? So we also need to simplify it and explain it not just in mathematical terms, but in human terms. And yes, the algorithms are very complex, and it's not really just math. It's a more sophisticated math with statistics and probability, and people get afraid when you start talking like that.
So Steven, can you tell us how do you see the development of AI in the near future? Some of the experts are predicting another AI winter in the years to come. What is your opinion about this?
Well, I think that if we do a good job, we don't have to go through the AI winter. So the first AI winter was really, we had all this theory and all this mathematics, but it was not practical at scale. So we didn't have the computational power. We have that now. It's not an issue. The AI winter, I think, that you're predicting is not caused by computational ineffectiveness. It's actually caused by society backlash. And I think it's our responsibility as practitioners to become more transparent and humanize the AI so that people aren't afraid, oh, it's going to replace my job, or it's making decisions on my behalf that I don't understand, there's bias and so on. So we have a lot of work to do in order to humanize the AI to avoid that second winter, if you will. But I do believe that as part of humanizing it, we're going to focus less on making the algorithms more and more accurate, which has really been the main focus over the last, let's say, 5 years, and rather focus on making them more explainable. So if I look at the research being done at MIT, at Stanford, in some of the universities in Canada, for example, they're focused on explainability. And how do I take this decision that I made and explain it to a layman, not necessarily a PhD in computer science, but a layman that can say, okay, now I understand how that decision was made, and I may not like the decision, but at least I can agree and understand that it was fair, and so on. So the research is kind of taking a diversion into focusing less on accuracy. We will always want to make accuracy better, but more on explainability. And I think that's very positive because that will help us examine what's going on and hopefully help us not eliminate, but at least reduce bias.
Okay, great, thank you. And being here in Brussels, in the heart of Europe, do you think that Europe has any chance competing in terms of AI race with the United States, for example? And what would you recommend European politicians to do in order to compete?
Yeah, this is an interesting question to ask someone from Silicon Valley because, to be honest, we have a joke in Silicon Valley. If there's a new technology, the EU will regulate it and Silicon Valley will monetize it. And politicians love to regulate. And I do believe that GDPR was actually an important piece of regulation because we needed to rebalance the scales of consumers versus corporate. We passed CCPA, California Consumer Protection. It doesn't go into effect until next year, so it's really 2 years after the EU. So I'm not completely dismissing regulation, but on the other hand, innovation requires a culture where you're willing to learn from failure. And I was in a conference in Germany, and I was surrounded on this panel with CIOs and CTOs from big German companies, and these very well-respected companies. And somebody from the audience said to me, asked the question, you know, in Germany we have great universities, we have a good engineering culture, we got a lot of smart people, why don't we have Silicon Valley? So everybody looks at me because I'm the Silicon Valley guy. And I've worked and lived in Europe enough to respond and says, look, I agree with everything you said. Germany has a great engineering culture. Germany has great universities. You got a lot of smart people. The problem is you're afraid to fail. Failure is actually an important part of innovation. And so culturally, you have to accept failure as part of the learning process. Not punish people for failure, but treat failure as an opportunity to learn. And I think in European culture, that's a little bit harder than in Silicon Valley culture, and you need to be able to do that. And it's unfair to characterize Europe, because Europe is very diverse, and there are definitely pockets of great research going on in AI and so on. But as an unfair generalization, the culture of failure is not as strong in European, particularly corporations and enterprise. I think the universities understand this pretty well, but getting it into corporate investments in AI, that's much more difficult. Now, there are definitely some notable exceptions, like Siemens has been doing amazing work in advancing AI across healthcare and transportation, all kinds of different areas. So I don't want to introduce unfair bias here, right? There are definitely people doing great stuff, but you have to adopt culture of failure as part of the learning.
Great, very interesting point. Thank you very much for your insight, Stephen Brobst. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.